makes of him our debtor for all eternity." End footnote. He soon became so good a monk that if anyone asked him the number of his brothers and sisters, he had to reflect and count them over before replying. A father asked him one day if he were never troubled by the thought of his family, to which, "I never think of them except when praying for them," was his only answer. Never was he seen to hold in his hand a flower or anything perfumed that he might take pleasure in it. On the contrary, in the hospital he used to seek for whatever was most disgusting, and eagerly snatch the bandages of ulcers, etc., from the hands of his companions. He avoided worldly talk, and immediately tried to turn every conversation on to pious subjects, or else he remained silent. He systematically refused to notice his surroundings. Being ordered one day to bring a book from the rector's seat in the refectory, he had to ask where the rector sat, for in the 3 months he had eaten bread there, so carefully did he guard his eyes that he had not noticed the place. One day during recess, having looked by chance on one of his companions, he reproached himself as for a grave sin against modesty. He cultivated silence, as preserving from sins of the tongue, and his greatest penance was the limit which his superiors set to his bodily penances. He sought after false accusations and unjust reprimands as opportunities of humility, and such was his obedience that, when a roommate, having no more paper, asked him for a sheet, he did not feel free to give it to him without first obtaining the permission of the superior, who, as such, stood in the place of God and transmitted his orders. I can find no other sorts of fruit than this of Louis's saintship. He died in 1591 in his 29th year, and is known in the church as the patron of all young people. On his festival, the altar in the chapel devoted to him on a certain church in Rome, "is embosomed with flowers, arranged with exquisite taste, and a pile of letters may be seen at its foot, written to the saint by young men and women, and directed to Paradiso. They are supposed to be burnt unread, except by San Luigi, who must find singular petitions in these pretty little missives, tied up now with a green ribbon, expressive of hope, now with a red one, emblematic of love, etc." Footnote. I cannot resist the temptation to quote from Starbuck's book, page 388, another case of purification by elimination. It runs as follows. "The signs of abnormality which sanctified persons show are of frequent occurrence. They get out of tune with other people. Often they will have nothing to do with churches which they regard as worldly. They become hypercritical towards others. They grow careless of their social, political, and financial obligations. As an instance of this type may be mentioned a woman of 68, of whom the writer made a special study. She had been a member of one of the most active and progressive churches in a busy part of a large city. Her pastor described her as having reached the censorious stage. She had grown more and more out of sympathy with the church. Her connection with it finally consisted simply in attendance at prayer meeting, at which her only message was that of reproof and condemnation of the others for living on a low plane. At last she withdrew from fellowship with any church. The writer found her living alone in a little room on the top story of a cheap boarding-house, quite out of touch with all human relations, but apparently happy in the enjoyment of her own spiritual blessings. Her time was occupied in writing booklets on sanctification, page after page of dreamy rhapsody. She proved to be one of a small group of persons who claim that entire salvation involves 3 steps instead of 2. Not only must there be conversion and sanctification, but a third, which they call crucifixion or perfect redemption, and which seems to bear the same relation to sanctification that this bears to conversion. She related how the Spirit had said to her, "Stop going to church, Stop going to holiness meetings. Go to your own room, and I will teach you. She professes to care nothing for colleges or preachers or churches, but only cares to listen to what God says to her. Her description of the experience seemed entirely consistent. She is happy and contented, and her life is entirely satisfactory to herself. While listening to her own story, one was tempted to forget that it was from the life of a person who could not live by it in conjunction with her fellows. Close quote. End footnote. Our final judgment of the worth of such a life as this will depend largely on our conception of God and of the sort of conduct he is best pleased with in his creatures. The Catholicism of the 16th century paid little heed to social righteousness, and to leave the world to the devil whilst saving one's own soul was then accounted no discreditable scheme. Today, rightly or wrongly, helpfulness in general human affairs is, in consequence of one of those secular mutations in moral sentiment of which I spoke, deemed an essential element of worth in character, and to be of some public or private use is also reckoned as a species of divine service. Other early Jesuits, especially the missionaries, among them the Javiers, the Brebeufs, the Jugs, were objective minds, and fought in their way for the world's welfare, so their lives today inspire us. But when the intellect, as in this Louis, is originally no larger than a pin's head, and cherishes ideas of God of corresponding smallness, the result, notwithstanding the heroism put forth, is on the whole repulsive. Purity, we see in the object lesson, is not the one thing needful, and it is better that a life should contract many a dirt mark than forfeit usefulness in its efforts to remain unspotted. Proceeding onwards in our search of religious extravagance, we next come upon excesses of tenderness and charity. Here saintliness has to face the charge of preserving the unfit and breeding parasites and beggars. Resist not evil. Love your enemies. These are saintly maxims on which men of this world find it hard to speak without impatience. Are the men of this world right, or are the saints in possession of the deeper range of truth? No simple answer is possible. Here, if anywhere, one feels the complexity of the moral life and the mysteriousness of the way in which facts and ideals are interwoven. Perfect conduct is a relation between three terms: the actor, the objects for which he acts, and the recipients of the action. In order that conduct should be abstractly perfect, all three terms, intention, execution, and reception, should be suited to one another. The best intention will fail if it either work by false means or address itself to the wrong recipient. Thus, no critic or estimator of the value of conduct can confine himself to the actor's animus alone, apart from the other elements of the performance. If there is no worse lie than a truth misunderstood by those who hear it, so reasonable arguments, challenges to magnanimity, and appeals to sympathy or justice, are folly when we are dealing with human crocodiles and boa constrictors. The saint may simply give the universe into the hands of the enemy by his trustfulness. He may, by non-resistance, cut off his own survival. Herbert Spencer tells us that the perfect man's conduct will appear perfect only when the environment is perfect. To no inferior environment is it suitably adapted. We may paraphrase this by cordially admitting that saintly conduct would be the most perfect conduct conceivable in an environment where all were saints already, but by adding that in an environment where few are saints, and many the exact reverse of saints, it must be ill adapted. We must frankly confess, then, using our empirical common sense and ordinary practical prejudices, that in the world that actually is, the virtues of sympathy, charity, and non-resistance may be, and often have been, manifested in excess. The powers of darkness have systematically taken advantage of them. the whole modern scientific